Okay, it's got a red dot. All right, we left off with food security. And in case you're wondering why I spent a fair amount of time on this issue, it's not like it's a huge biblical issue, but it's because it's something that in our day, we rarely have experienced an issue with food, not being able to have enough food, get enough food, but yet has been the common experience of people throughout time. It's only in the very recent time that it's not an issue. It's been a huge issue from as far back as we have recorded time. And here in the Genesis 26, we're talking about a famine. So let's go in and well, let me back up. And the reason you need to understand it is a problem all the way through the Old and the New Testament. And you'll understand a lot of the things that go on a lot better if you understand that in the average man and woman's life, not the super wealthy people, but the common man, food security was a big issue. It was a really big issue. Because it didn't take much for them to not have any food and go through a time of starving. So let's go read through 26, 1 to 5 again. It says, "Now there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws.'" And another point is that Abraham and Isaac both, very wealthy. And yet, when there's a famine, it affects everybody. Because they didn't have the ability to move and transport food like we do today with the transportation systems that we have. And so this is a big issue, and at some point in the future, it could become an issue here again, depending on what happens in our future. But in most ancient time, most people spend most of their time trying to get enough food, and that's why food had more value than money did. You would be paid in food very often because that's the thing that was most important. Also, famines and poor harvests were common. In your area, if not even a famine, if there was just a poor harvest, there wasn't much food. And so it made life very difficult. Food was then more valuable than gold and silver in most cases. And it's only with, not just with modern transportation, but global connected economies, irrigation, artificial fertilizer. That's a big part of it. Now, in modern times, a lot of people are very against artificial fertilizers because they say they don't really provide the full amount of nutrients. They do make the plants grow and so on and so forth. Funny thing is, though, however you want to look at it, we've been artificially fertilizing food for a long time and we're all still alive, that type of thing, and pretty healthy as a country. So, but that is a big issue. It's one of the things that when you do a lot of study of ancient history, it's one of those things that hits you that you don't experience both water and food. And those days were both very difficult. It could be very hard to come by, especially clean water. And a lot of diseases because of not having clean water. It was the Romans that became super good at providing water with their aqueducts and all the different ways that they transported water around their countries, their empire. All right, so let's see. Last week I told you about, that book I read about semi-trucks blowing up randomly and that shutting all the trucking down that basically took the American economy down in like a week. And it's amazing. It just shows how fragile we think. Most Americans think that it's this robust system that'll last forever, and they don't realize how fragile it is. And now in the West, with the number of people moving to the Southwest, now people are starting to understand the value of water, which has always been of enormous importance up until recent times. Again, this is a recent thing that, we have water filtration systems and all that we have where water's always been one of the most important and valuable commodities. I mean, the wars in the West were fought over water. The Lincoln County War and different wars that they call them wars. They weren't like, two nations, but they were people fighting over water because it's so important. So now we had something like this running out of food during World War II, or World War I. So it actually has happened here. This is a food protest in New York City because there wasn't enough food to go around and the government was trying to help distribute it. And a lot of times it went from a protest to a riot. Because the funny thing is, your common, average, nonviolent person changes dramatically when there's suddenly no food to feed them and their families. And violence becomes very, very common. And again, that helps us understand the culture of what's happening in the time that we're reading about and studying in the Bible. Because, of course, the war caused food shortages, people began to protest, then turned into riots. Okay, now we're back on to the next part. Tells us that Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Now, very likely what he was doing, he wasn't headed for Gerar to stay there. That's why God appears to him and says, don't leave the country. Don't go to Egypt. That's where he's headed. And the reason he goes to Gerar is because of this. I think I have one more. Let me see. Yeah, he's living in this area. He wants to get to Egypt. This is all nasty, horrible desert with no water and no food. So the main way to go was what you see here, the coastal route. So he's headed for the coastal route, and that Gerar is right in there. That causes him to go to Gerar. And when he gets there, God tells him to stop and don't go any farther. And this map shows you where it actually is. He was living in this area, and he went that way, headed to Egypt, and God said, nope, don't go any farther. Now, one of the things I find interesting in this is that Abimelech is still alive. It's amazing, because that's the guy that interacted with Abraham, Isaac's father. Isaac's 60 years old at this point. And we don't know how old Abimelech is, but he's got to be 80, 90, something like that. Because, remember, Abraham was dealing with Abimelech before Isaac was born. And now Isaac is dealing with Abimelech. And it's been 60 years. So that would put him at least at 80 or older. So this is one of those guys that lived to be quite old. Also, another thing to remember is when you read things that give you the average lifespan in different periods, remember that doesn't mean that people didn't live to be 70, 80, and 90 years old. What happens is so many babies died in childbirth that offsets the average age. When you have like twice as many people dying at 0, that really kind of changes the average age. If you made it to about 20, it's very likely you could make it to 60, 70, and beyond. Unless you were in the very low classes, and then you would die just due to lack of nutrition and things of that nature, and too much work. But yet people live to be that old in a lot of places during those times. Now, Isaac's first instinct is to head for Egypt. God intervenes, tells him to stay in the land of Canaan, dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. And God was the one who told Isaac to go to Gerar instead of Egypt. So that kind of pops up the question, why would Isaac's first instinct to be to go to Egypt during a famine? Calvin?
Egypt was a land that didn't have a lot of famines.
Why?
Because of the Nile?
Because of the Nile, absolutely. They had the Nile River. Not only did it provide water for irrigation, and the Nile, at times in its history, would go low, but it never goes dry. But remember, it flooded every year and brought in new soil. And that's what made Egypt so tremendously productive. In all the other areas, like you go over to the areas around Babylon, in the area of Mesopotamia between the two rivers, where they irrigated, two things would happen. Number one, you grow the same plants on the same soil over and over and over. What happens? You deplete the soil. But also, when you do lots of irrigating, it leaves salts in the soil. Almost all bodies of water have some kind of salts, not table salt as we think of it, but other kinds of salts. But anyway, when that stuff builds up, then nothing will grow. Yet, see, Egypt got new soil every year with new nutrients and all that. So they had very large harvests and very reliable. And you'll notice throughout the Bible, whenever there's a famine in the Middle East, where does everybody head? They all go to Egypt. And that's what made Egypt very wealthy and very powerful. And see, most of the other empires got their wealth, or at least their beginning wealth, from taking over other people and the spoils of war and creating the empire. Egypt never had to do that. Just through selling grain and trade, they became extremely wealthy. It's also why their empire lasted so long. It's the longest lasting of all empires when you follow it from its beginning to its end. And it was because of the fact that they could sell their food. The only time they actually ever got out of Egypt was they went up along the coastal area of Israel and took a few cities there. And that was it, but they didn't find a lot of wealth in that area. And they didn't really go inland. They just took the coastal areas. Part of that being areas where they could run ships more easily, because the Nile, when it gets to the Mediterranean, turns into basically a great big swamp. The delta there with all the little tributaries, it made it more difficult to get in and out with ships and that type of thing. So see, Egypt didn't have to go to war, fight wars, spend the money on wars in order to get wealthy. They did it through trade. And later on, there are other empires that figure this out. We can get way richer through trade, and nobody has to die, and everybody likes us. Like the Phoenicians and others, that did what they called, now I can't think of the word. Anywhere they're what they called sea-time empires. They didn't take over any land, they just took over all the trade routes and controlled those, and then made enormous amounts of money. The Phoenicians did it, the Minoans did it. Later on, the Venetians of Venice did it, the Dutch and the English, all of them did it that way by having ships and running trade across the world. Now, let's see. And then also Egypt was also wealthy simply because they were rarely attacked, because what's on each side of Egypt? Desert. In fact, it's not even on each side of Egypt, on each side of the Nile. You don't have to go far from the Nile, and this nasty, horrible desert that nobody could cross with an army. And so they were insulated. Finally, there were some that came along the northern coast of North Africa, and then what really got them was when they finally had people who had large flotillas of ships that figured out they could attack Egypt through the Delta and through the Nile. But that was much later in their life cycle. So they were very protected. So that's where everybody would go. It's safe, there's food, and the Egyptians didn't mind selling it to you. So they would head that way. So that's where he's going. But God tells him, nope, don't go there, rely on me, not on Egypt. So Isaac has to exercise his faith to be able to feed himself and his family and all of the people that he now has. So, and God reiterates to Isaac that if he is faithful like his father was faithful, if he's obedient and he stays in the land of Canaan and doesn't go to Egypt, does what God tells him to do, he'll make sure they have enough food, but he'll also give them many other blessings. God tells, I'll give you all the blessings that I said to your father. We'll give you the land of Canaan. You'll have uncountable offspring. The whole world will be blessed through your offspring. Those kinds of things. And so what we see in the passage, it says, and in your offspring, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. That was verse 4. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So God reiterates the promise that he gave to Abraham. And this is the first recorded time that we have where God gives the promise directly to Isaac, not just as an inheritance from his father, but God comes in and says, yes, you get the inheritance of Abraham. You get the fulfillment of the promise. And so he said that you're going to be it. And he says that all people on earth will be blessed through Isaac's offspring, which is, of course, referring to what? I guess I should say, to who? To Jesus. He is the one from the Jewish line that the entire world is blessed by. It's the life of Christ and salvation. But God also states that this tremendous blessing coming to Isaac, because so far, Isaac has not had to exercise any faith to this point, has he? He hasn't. So what he does is he makes sure that Isaac understands that the reason Isaac can be part of this blessing is because of his father's faith, and his father's obedience, the evidence of his faith. Faith always has evidence, and that evidence is always in obedience or action, however you want to look at it. Such as most people don't know what makes a large metal airplane fly, how it gets off the ground and stays in the air. And yet, what will they do? Get on it and fly. Absolutely. Their faith isn't true faith until it's exercised in getting on the plane. You could go to someone and say, do you have faith that plane can fly? Absolutely. Will you get on it? No. Well, then you don't have any faith. You just don't. And that's how it works. That's what James is telling us in his book, where people think that he and Paul were at odds. And I'll be honest with you, I don't understand how anybody thought Paul and James were at odds. Because, Paul says we're saved by grace, period. Right? Then James just comes along and says, if you're really saved, just like if you really have faith, there's evidence, your works. And then somehow people said, oh, James is saying you're saved by works. He never says that. He never alludes to that. Never. And yet, I don't know, I think people are just looking for things to argue about. So Abraham was extremely faithful. to God. Because look how God lists it out. I like how he doesn't just say, Abraham obeyed my voice. Abraham was obedient. He doesn't say that. He covers every way you could be obedient. He obeyed my voice. He kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. He covers every base you could probably come up with. And he's just saying Abraham was extremely obedient. Whether God gave it as a law, as a commandment, as a statute, as a direct something he said to him, something he charged him with that's not part of the law or the commandments, such as stay in the land, and he did. Or get up and go, and he did. That type of thing. So he was very faithful and obedient. He followed God's will in, almost everything. Just when it came down to Sarah and other men. And it's funny, in a minute we're going to find out Isaac inherited that gene. Because he lies about Rebekah to poor Abimelech, the same guy that was lied to by his father Abraham. If I was Abimelech, I'd think, these Jews are just a bunch of liars. Because every time I get in contact with them, they lie to me. And it's just amazing how we humans are, that they can have this tremendous faith over here and no faith over here, dealing with the same God. But that's just how we are. We're humans, and God shows that we're humans. So now, think about how the world and life has changed because Abraham was willing to be obedient. Did Abraham himself accomplish any great spiritual thing? He really didn't. What was his primary command that God gave him about his life?
Wander around.
Yeah, that was his mission from God. Wander around this land. That's it. And that's what he did. And I'm sure while he was wandering around, he was saying to God, what am I doing? Why am I just wandering around? When is something going to happen? Do we do this? Absolutely. God lets us know there's something he wants us to do, and we expect all kinds of different things, and one day we find out, as Emily just said, God says, no, I'll stay put and be content. Oh, that's what you wanted. That type of thing. And that's what's happening here. Other than the fact that he did defeat the 4 kings that attacked Sodom and Gomorrah, that was a little amazing. Outside of that, he just basically wandered around the land. And I think, and yet through that obedience, you think he had any idea while he's wandering around the land of Canaan that he will have a descendant that will bring salvation to humanity? No. Did God tell him? No. All he said is humanity will be blessed. He has no idea how. And yet we find in Hebrews that God says Abraham was a great man because he had faith and he believed God, even though he never saw the result of what God had promised. And it didn't happen for quite a long time after his death. Now notice that God doesn't include any kind of emotions, feelings, or intentions in his explanation of why Abraham received these great blessings. What does he bring it all down to? One thing: obedience. And that's pretty much what God brings it down to in every place in the Bible. It comes down to obedience. That is what God is after from us, because that's also what gives us the best life. Now, as I said, God covers every form of communication. He obeyed my voice. Whatever God said, Abraham obeyed. He kept my charge. If God told him to do something, he did it. Kept my commandments, kept my statutes, and kept my laws. And a lot of these, there's not that much difference between these. We would try to, what's the difference between a statute and a law? That's really not the point. What God is doing is he's just saying, in every way you can be obedient, he was obedient. In every possible way. So from this, we begin to learn that obedience is extremely important. In fact, from God's perspective and what he says in the Bible, obedience is the ultimate, I've lost the word, expression of our love. Obedience. Is that how we look at love on the earth? That the greatest expression of love is obedience? It's, warm, fuzzy feelings. Things of that nature. That's how we look at it. Being romantic or whatever the case may be. Yet God says, no, it's obedience. Because how does God define love? Emotionally? God says to love is to put the needs of your neighbor before your own. Something we have to be obedient to. As Jesus did for us. Jesus loved us. Died on the cross. He was obedient and on our behalf died for us. So the same thing. So, according to God, what is the highest expression of our love for him? Obedience. Not things that we think of. Emotion. Singing and worshiping is great. That is not the ultimate in obedience or worship. The ultimate expression of worship is obedience. And so those things are good, but they're not the ultimate. And then doing things for God. That's another one we get caught up in. I love God, so I'm going to go do stuff for him. Nowhere in the Bible. Nowhere. In fact, that's the opposite of the Bible. God tells us to do what? Be obedient. You notice he doesn't say, think up some great thing to do for me. God says, I'm always at work. I'm always carrying out my will, and I'm going to invite you to join me. Just be obedient. And yet, how many times have you heard teachers and preachers and pastors say, go out and dream a dream for God. Do something great for God. And I'm like, that is so opposite the Bible, I wish you would just shut up. Because it is absolutely unbiblical. Because when you go do something great for God, who's making the decision of what will be done? And what do you know? Nothing. Absolutely. In fact, most cases when we do that, we get in God's way. Or we create something God never wanted us to have around, and it causes all kinds of problems. That's why God is so clear. Be obedient. There's plenty to do. I'll give you stuff to do. Now, he may have you wandering around your entire life, and that's all you get. But that's okay. You have no idea what the ramifications of that are. As Abraham had no idea what was going to happen after he died. Changes the entire world. Creates the nation of Israel, which didn't exist before. That type of thing. So we have to be very careful about that. God created the master plan when? Before he created anything. He had the master plan every day, every moment, every event planned. In there, he gives us a little bit of leeway, but very little. We can't change the overall plan. Can't speed it up, can't slow it down. I can remember when I was a kid hearing a preacher say, do these things that you see in, I think, Revelation so that we can speed up the coming. Duh, no. There's a date set and nothing's going to change it. It's going to happen when God has said it's going to happen. And that's it. And that date's not going to change. He's always at work. He invites us to join him. Our job is to be obedient. And we see this all through the New Testament. In Philippians, we find this. This is Jesus. So being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So even the Son of God was the highest expression of his love. Obedience. That's right. In John 14:15, if you love me, this is what Jesus says, you will keep my commandments. You would think he would say, if you love me, you will worship me, you will do this, you will do that. That's not what it says. It says, keep my commandments. And then in John 15:10, he goes on to say, if you keep my commandments, you'll abide in my love. What's the opposite of that? If you don't keep his commandments, don't expect to abide in his love. That doesn't mean you get kicked out of the kingdom. It just means you won't experience God's love because you're not in God's will. The commandments is what keeps us in God's will. And so it says, you will abide in my love just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So again, he reiterates that. Remember the model prayer. What does the model prayer say? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So what's the difference between the two? In heaven, how quickly are the angels obedient? Instantly. How about us? Sometimes. Not so much sometimes. But that's what he's saying there. He wants us to be as obedient as the beings are in the kingdom in God's presence. And that's the whole point. Now, let's see. If it wasn't for Abraham's faith, trust, and obedience, all of that, the Jewish people and nation would never have existed, which means Jesus wouldn't have existed. I mean, it's got enormous ramifications. So now it's time for Isaac to demonstrate the same type of obedience to the Lord as his father did. See, Isaac's at his decision point. He's still in the land of Canaan. He's in the area we call Philistia, or where the Philistines are, which means that's probably still in the famine as well. And yet God says to him, stay here. And he's got his wife and kids and all of that. And not only that, he has a lot of servants by this point in time and animals, and he wants to keep all that alive. It was not a simple decision. Yes, God says stay here, I'll stay here. You know, there's not a lot of food where you are, and you look over towards Egypt and there's lots of food. That's a tough decision. And so let's see what he does. Verse 6. So Isaac settled in Gerar. Good for Isaac. And it says, it doesn't say that he just still was a nomad. He settled there because God said, stay here, basically until I tell you to go somewhere else. And so he settles in Gerar. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, she is my sister. For he feared to say, my wife, thinking, lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, so remember that, he's been there a long time when this next event happens. Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister? Isaac said to him, because I thought, lest I die because of her. Abimelech, if I was Abimelech, I'd have said, that again? Are you kidding me? You're just like your father. But he says instead, what is this you have done to us? Same thing he said to Abraham. One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. So, again, we find, it's funny, Isaac wasn't alive when Abraham did it. Now, I don't know if the story went around the camp, probably. And maybe some of the servants told Isaac what had happened, who knows. But from a human perspective, that would be very, very likely. And it's funny, though, because if he did know the story, he would know that God protected Abraham, and yet he goes and does the same thing. It's amazing to me. And it's just amazing to have all this faith in other areas and none when it comes to this. Also kind of tells us that in that day, at least in that area, it must have been legal for men to go just grab women and sleep with them. Because that's what Abimelech says. Somebody might have slept with your wife. And so you're not guilty if she's not married. You're guilty only if she's married, which is a kind of interesting different morals than we think of today. Because we do find a lot of that in not just ancient times, even in North America and that kind of stuff. It was very common when white men first came into a lot of the Native American villages that they would offer them the young women for the night. That was just part of being hospitable. Here, take my daughter. In today's world, it's like, I will kill you if you touch my daughter. Very different way. But see, what are women back then? Property. So it wasn't a big deal, at all. So we find that Isaac is very obedient to the God. He settles in Gerar. We also find that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in this case, because he does exactly what his father does. At least with Abraham, it was kind of true. Sarah was his half-sister. Rebecca is not his sister in any way, shape, or form. So you're just out. I don't know if there's a difference, but it's a really bold lie. So he should have said, well, you know what? She has a terrible disease. That'll protect her. So he's afraid the men will kill him to get her. Also tells us that both Sarah and Rebecca were very attractive. Because he's 60. So it's been 20 years since they got married. She's still relatively young, but she must have been very attractive that, he's afraid he's going to die, because men want to sleep with her. So my question I always ask is, so then is it okay to kill the husband and then sleep with her? Because we're only guilty if he's alive. Who knows? They have very different ways of looking at things. So, and it's, was this like a thing that went across the Middle East, that the men of Gerar were known for killing men to get their wives? You kind of wonder where Isaac gets this thought. But it probably wasn't that uncommon going around to other places. Remember, there's no cops, there's no judges. A few kings might have a small military garrison they kept that would kind of serve as cops, but not in this kind of stuff, So men were kind of left to do what they wanted. That's also why we have the blood avenger. Remember the blood avenger? It's in the Bible. And I told you when I lived in Pakistan as a kid, it was still active in Pakistan. If the blood avenger is if someone kills a relative, an uncle, a cousin, whatever, you are duty bound to hunt them down and kill them. And it's totally legal for you to do that. And in the Bible, that's true. God even sets up the laws where he sets up the cities of the Levites that are the safe cities, the refuge cities, that the blood avenger can come after you, but if you make it to one of the refuge cities, then they can't get you. And there they put you on trial, figure out if you're guilty or not, And if you're not guilty, that's great, but you can't ever leave because the blood avengers are outside and they can kill you anytime they find you, even though you've been found not guilty. Talk about curbing murder. If you murdered somebody and you knew every male in that family was going to start hunting you down to kill you, you'd probably think a little longer about doing it. And that's how it was. It was every male in the family would hunt you down. They were duty bound to hunt you down and take your life. That's the blood avenger. It drives me crazy, though, that the Bible doesn't really explain it to any detail. It just says it exists. That's all it really says about it. So now, here's the thing I find funny, and this might embarrass you a little bit about it's where they have a very hard time, the translators do, when we get to verse 8, and it says, when he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. That is actually a very, very poor translation. What's happening here is the translators are trying to clean it up. The Bible is very explicit. There are parts of the Bible in the original language that you probably couldn't even read through because it's almost pornographic in what it describes. But the Bible is very blunt, very clear, and very explicit. So, your question should be, he's laughing with this woman. How would that tell you that's his wife? If that's true, then I got a whole bunch of wives because I made a lot of women laugh. It's like, huh? So here's how I looked at a bunch of different translations. I was kind of surprised with the ESV that it did this, because it's trying to be the most literal. You also don't want people all getting mad at you because you're too explicit. And so it's been translated as laughing with, caressing. I like the King James, sporting with. What, they're playing baseball? But sporting during the Middle Ages was heavy petting and sex, is what it was. Or in others, it says playing with. Actually, the word that's translated here means sexual foreplay. That's what it literally means. So he looks out the window, and Isaac and Rebekah are out there in the bushes somewhere, doing husband and wife stuff, and Abimelech sees them. And I'm not really sure sexual foreplay is not that terrible, why they just didn't put what's really in there, because laughing just doesn't really fit,
Mine says showing endearment.
Yeah. Or you could have even said being intimate,
Endearment.
something like that, showing endearment. What translation do you have?
New King James.
New King James, okay. So-
It says sporting.
That's my favorite, sporting.
Caressing.
Yeah, caressing's probably, of all of these, caressing's the closest to what it actually says. So what does Abimelech has to confront Isaac now, just like he did his father? Same story, same insecurity, And in this case, we find that Abimelech is more moral than Isaac. Yeah, and both these guys, they're poor wives. You can have her, just don't kill me. Type of thing. Fortunately, God protected both of them, so nobody touched them. If you remember, Sarah even ended up in Abimelech's harem, yet God protected her and nobody touched her. So now, and then Abimelech says, nobody touches either one of these people upon pain of death. Nobody in the kingdom, you do not mess with Isaac and Rebekah or you will die. So if any man was to try to come after her, it also means Isaac has the right to kill him. Or Abimelech himself will take care of it. Okay, then we kind of shift gears in verse 12. And Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. And Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we. And this is a very interesting passage. So the first thing we talked about this last week, that even though he and his father both were nomads, when they came to an area that had fertile soil and had enough rain, they would plant crops. And usually grain, because that's a crop that you can store. Not many other crops can be stored for long amounts of time. And that's why grains and beans both became the staples of different cultures. They can be dried and they'll last for a very long time. They have actually opened, I'm trying to think of where this was. It was in England, Great Britain, on the island there. They opened up a 4,500-year-old cache of wheat that was still viable. Because what they would do is dig these kind of vase-shaped holes in the ground, put them down in there, and then they would take and put a plug in the top that completely sealed it. No air, no nothing could get into it. And they also lined it with clay so the moisture wouldn't get into it, and that stuff would last a really long time. And that's why they kind of became the staples. Now it says that he sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. Now we kind of blow right through that. Apparently the famine did not hit I can't say it didn't hit the Philistine country because we don't know exactly the time sequence here. We know that by the time Abimelech realized that Rebekah was his wife, it said he'd been there a long time. So maybe the famine was over. It had started raining again. Maybe that's what prompted him to plant. But he gets, what we blow by is we say, 100-fold, that's great, and we move on. That's not great. That is astounding. It is far beyond anything that happened in that day. It's far beyond what we can produce today by factors, not by percents type of thing. And so it's an enormous amount. He got back 100 times what he planted. So when you really, personally, who would love an investment like that? You get back not twice or 3 times, 100 times what you put in there. And that's basically what he did. So apparently God caused it to rain a lot more in the area than it does today, because that doesn't happen in that area today. It's quite dry type of thing. Now, I was trying to figure out what common harvests were back in ancient times. But see, back in that time, they didn't really record that kind of stuff. So I ended up going to the 300s AD, but you can know that farther back you go, the lower the harvest would have probably been, because farming learns more as time goes by. So in the 300s AD, a really good harvest was 12 times. A really good harvest was 12 times. Isaac gets 100 times what he planted. And he's using ancient growing techniques and relying on the rain. In most cases, you only get 2 to 4 times what you sow. So I wanted to put it into numbers because to me it makes a lot more of an impact. So it tells us that he harvested 100 times what he planted. If he planted 100 bushels, he would harvest 10,000. That's how we measure wheat in America, bushels, which unless you were raised on a farm means nothing to us. It's a bushel basket full, that type of thing. But think about that. If he planted 100 bushels, he'd have harvested 10,000. That's enormous. So a bushel is 60 pounds of wheat. So let's put it in real numbers. 100 bushels equals 6,000 pounds of seed. So if he put out 6,000 pounds of seed, which is a lot, but look what he would have harvested. 600,000 pounds of wheat for food, which is an enormous, enormous amount of food for them. So this is God. Remember, God said, if you stay here, what will he do? He'll bless you. And so his first crop is 100 times. Here's the funny thing. Probably no one around him had anywhere near that. They're planting in the same soil, with the same rain, and yet he's getting way more than they are. And again, that's God pointing to the fact he's the true and living God, and I'm active in the lives of my people, and you can see it right here, that this is happening to him. And because of this and other things, Isaac becomes extremely wealthy, more so than Abraham. In fact, he becomes so wealthy and so powerful that you saw where Abimelech tells him to leave. You're getting too powerful. We're afraid you'll take us over type of thing. So now, here's the interesting thing is, remember, Isaac didn't receive all of Abraham's wealth. He inherited the blessing, and he inherited the main bulk of it. But remember, Abraham had a lot more sons, by Keturah and by Hagar. And we were told in the previous passages that he gave them gifts, and I'm sure he gave them really good gifts. Keturah had 6 sons. So you've got her 6 sons and Ishmael that he all gave gifts to. So what Isaac got was much less than what Abraham had. But yet, very quickly, God turns that into way more than Abraham had. because Isaac is being faithful just like Abraham was. So not only did he have these tremendous harvests, but God also caused his herds to grow and his servants to have a lot of children. And there must have been a lot of servants by now, because basically what Abimelech is saying, you've got more people that could fight than I do. Because that's the only way that you'd scare him and take him over is if you had, remember, Abraham had 318 trained men. Well, it's been a long time, and all those men and all those women have had kids who've had kids who've had kids, and they're all still his servants. Because if you're born to two servants, you're a servant until your owner decides to set you free. So he's grown to be enormous, and of course, what does that do to the Philistines? Envy him and fear him. Here's what's funny about humans to me. Your farm's here, you get a harvest of 4 times what you planted. Isaac's over here, he gets 100 times. You go and ask him, Isaac, why did you have such a huge harvest? Because of my God. Don't you think the logical thing would be to convert to that God?
Yeah.
But instead, what do? You envy him, and you get mad at him, and you kick him out. That's what you do. Instead of actually taking the great wealth that was being, this great blessing that seemed to be offered to you. They envy him, and they want him gone. Okay. And I even had the question, how would you like it if you had a field next to Isaac's and his produced 10 times what yours did? That kind of thing. And like I said, you would think it would cause the people to want to know and serve Isaac's God, but it didn't. In fact, it did the opposite. Instead, they just wanted him gone so they didn't have to deal with him. And this is how it's been from God's people from the beginning. It's always been this way. That it doesn't seem to matter how God works in the life of his people and how it's very different than the lives of the people around him. Instead of saying, I want what you got, they say, get out of here. I don't want to see you anymore. And you see this in whole cultures, and then you see it all the way down to the personal level. Like, let's say you've got 2 really good friends, grew up together, and then in their 30s, one of them gets saved. They no longer drink, cuss, they're moral, they're ethical. What usually happens to that relationship? It falls apart. And it falls apart because the non-Christian doesn't want to hang out with you anymore. Even though you don't judge them, you don't say a word about what's going on in their life, they always feel judged because you don't do it. It's the same thing that's always amazed me, that if you don't drink, especially when you're younger, and all your friends do, what do they constantly do? Try to get you to drink. And you're like, why does it matter to you whether I drink or not? You obviously think it's okay. I don't, so I'm not going to. But see, I think there's something deep down inside them that says, drinking to excess is not okay. And you're like this glaring thing that keeps telling them that, and that they don't want to see it, get away from me. And that it falls apart. That's extremely common. It happens all the time. And it's been that way for us since the beginning. You would think it would draw people to God. So like in the life of a Christian, if we're living the way God tells us to, our lives are rock solid, stable. Our marriages last till we die. We're generally much more fulfilled. Doesn't mean we have easier lives. In most cases, we have harder lives because Satan hates us. He's in control of the world, and so God allows him to be involved in our lives. And so we have a lot of tests and trials and all those kinds of things. Other people do too, non-Christians, but we seem to have an awful lot. We can, if we're living by God's word, we have a lot less stress. We can actually learn to be content, all those things. You would think that would draw people to Christ, but what does it do in many cases? Just the opposite. Christians have always been pushed to the fringes of a culture, regardless of the culture. Whether it was the culture of the first century, the Old Testament with the Jews, they're always pushed to the fringe of the culture, always. And it's always bothered me when I've heard preachers try to tell us that if we do certain things, that we'll get pushed to the center of the culture. That's never happened, and it's never going to. The Christians in the church are always going to be on the fringe of culture. There's been a few anomalies, like the United States, founded by Christian people and basing it on Christian law, and for a while that worked okay, but where are we today? Where are Christians? Mainstream? No, we're on the fringes. In fact, it worries me greatly when Christianity is mainstream. Because if it's mainstream, that usually means the message has been changed. because the mainstream doesn't like the message, you're a sinner. Ever told someone, that's a great evangelism tool. You're a sinner. That just makes people mad at you. It's about all that it does. And people don't want to hear it, they don't like it, they don't want to see it, none of that. And that's why we're always pushed to the fringes. So it was the same with Israel. What was Israel supposed to do? If they followed God's will, they were supposed to do exactly what the foreshadowing of Abraham and Isaac. God said, you are obedient to my will, you do what I tell you to do. And he said, what will happen is you will have harvests that are so great, the harvesters, they're trying to get out of the field, and it's going all the way into the springtime of the next year because the plowman's trying to get in the other end of the field to start plowing. I mean, that's enormous harvest, and that's the whole country. So they would be fabulously wealthy with food and gold and silver and peace. And he also says, and you'll defeat every enemy that comes against you. No one can defeat you. And they are to be this shining light. Isn't it interesting in the New Testament what we call light of the earth? They would be the shining light that would draw other nations to them to say, why is your nation like this? And they could say, the one true God. That's why. But what did they do? They took all the gods of the other peoples, and therefore they had all the problems that they had and weren't any different than anybody else. But that's how it was supposed to work. And even during the times when it did work under David and Solomon, where they became very wealthy and very powerful, it's still other nations didn't like them and wanted to attack them. And as soon as Solomon was gone, that's exactly what happened. And then Israel's in basically continual raids and war until the Babylonians destroy them from that time forward. So it's interesting how we see that all throughout, And also we see this in the end. During the tribulation, Christians will be spared many of the plagues that God brings upon the earth. Some they'll experience because they happen to the whole earth, like when a third of the water turns to blood, things of that nature. Although God will still provide for his people. But there are some very obvious, like this in Revelation 16:2 and then later in 8 and 9. It says, so the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the earth, and harmful and painful sores came upon the people who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. So who's the only one that gets the boils all over their bodies? Those who have the mark of the beast. The only people who don't have the mark of the beast are the born again. That's it. Everybody else takes it. So the Christians are walking around with no sores, no boils, no pain, none of that. So how does that make everybody else feel about him? Hate him even more. They already hated him, but hate him even more. Because when this says these boils, they're all over your body. You can't sit, you can't lay, you can't stand. There is no way to be comfortable because they're everywhere. Same as what Job had way back in his book. We think of a boil as like here or here. Or imagine your entire body. Bottoms of your feet, your behind, everywhere. Can't lay, can't sit, nothing. You're in pain all the time. Then in verse 8 it says, the fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to scorch people with fire. They were scorched by the fierce heat, and they cursed the name of God who had power over these plagues. They did not repent and give him glory. So who are the only ones being scorched? The people with the mark, not the Christians. They're walking around. In fact, if you look at what this describes, these people can't leave a building. If they go outside, the sun is so intense, it will literally burn their skin like a fire. And so they have to stay inside or be totally covered with all kinds of stuff to try to go outside. Yet the Christians are walking around not having any problem whatsoever because it's not bothering them. Emily?
So you're talking about people that have been saved after the rapture?
Yep, the Bible tells us there will be a lot saved after the rapture. In fact, the rapture will probably cause a lot of people to get saved. Right now, like if the rapture happened today, there are an awful lot of people on this planet that went to church when they were kids, that were taught the Bible and all of that, and know what it says, but never gave their lives to Christ, never bought into it. And we all disappear at the same time, and the only commonality is we're all Christians. Them are the people that are going to say, whoa, that was really true. That'll be part of it. But others will also convert as what goes on during the times. Remember, there's the Jewish evangelists, 144,000 super evangelists that go across the world evangelizing. The beast can't harm them. He can't kill them. He can't hurt them. He can't stop them. And they go around. Then later on, there's an angel that flies in the sky and speaks the gospel from a supernatural perspective. So there will be a lot of people who get saved. In fact, it tells us that under the altar, one of the images that John gets of heaven is under the altar are uncountable souls, under the incense altar. And John even asks, who are they? And God says they're the ones that were killed during the tribulation. So there's an enormous number of them that convert. There's an enormous number that don't, but there's an enormous number that does as well. So we can see it here. So wouldn't you think that if you're one of the people with the sores and the heat, and the Christians weren't experiencing this, wouldn't it make logical sense for you to convert to what they believe? And you know what happens? They curse God, and they hate the Christians, and they basically try to murder them all. Exactly how it's always been. All down through time. It never changes. You know? Now, the last thing about this, because we've only got about 30 seconds left, is I find it so strange that in this desert environment, what did Abimelech's servants do to Abraham's wells? They filled them up. What kind of a crazy person goes around and fills up functioning wells? But it's because they had such a disdain and dislike for Abraham and also for Isaac that they filled in his wells. But you'll find as we go to the next passage, what does Isaac do? Digs them all out, you know, because really it's easier, you know, if you're digging somewhere where somebody filled it in, the dirt's still soft. You can dig it all out. It takes a lot of work, but you can dig it out. So one of the things to remember also is by this time, Isaac has a lot of servants. He has a very large body of people that now move around with him everywhere he goes. Enough that it scared the kingdom of Gerar, and they said, please go away from us and go somewhere else. And we're out of time. We're going to have to stop there.